Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to do the granny stitch in straight lines. In straight lines so that you can do rectangle blankets. A lot of granny stitches are done as a granny square or they're done in triangles or in circles. And a lot of people don't know how to do it just in straight lines so that they can incorporate it into blankets that they want to have that cluster stitch in. So I am going to show you how to do it. Simple granny stitch and how to do it in a straight line. Back and forward, back and forward, back and forward. So I'm going to do a sample for this and you're going to do your stitches in sets of 3. I'll just do a small sample. You can do it however wide you want and do it in sets of 3. So that's 1, 2 and 3. 1, 2 and 3. 1, 2 and 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Then you're going to add an extra 2 stitches. 1 and 2. And into the third stitch in my chain, I'm going to add 2 more stitches. If you're in the UK, these are treble crochets for you, and if you're in the USA, these are double crochets. 1 and 2. Now that counts as your first stitch of your granny stitch. The granny stitch is a cluster of 3 stitches, so 1, 2 and 1 more into that stitch is 3. I'm going to skip 2 stitches, 1, 2 and put a cluster in the next one. So skip 2 stitches, 1, 2 and put your cluster in. And 3. Skip 2, 1, 2 and do another cluster. 1, 2 and 3. Skip 2, 1, 2 and do another cluster. I'm going to skip my 2 stitches and do my last cluster in this end stitch. Now if you've miscounted, you can use your tail, and what you can do is you can make an extra stitch. You can make yourself an extra stitch with the tail if you have to. I'm going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3 and turn my work around. So what we're going to have is a cluster, a space all the way up. So we're going to skip this cluster and go in and do a cluster in this space here. And when you do that, you'll be creating a space above this cluster for your next row. So a cluster into each space in between your granny stitches. We're putting 3 together in the same space to create a granny cluster. So into the top of the last stitch of that cluster, you're going to put 1 treble crochet in through the stitch. You're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3 and turn your work around. So you've got a cluster and a space. So now we need another cluster. So we're going to put a cluster into that space. So this counts as your first stitch. So into that space, you're going to put 2 more stitches to make your cluster. Move over to the next one and put 1 cluster into each space along. So at the end, we've got a space, so we're going to put a cluster in. 1, 2, and 3. Now we're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn. So you can now see you've got a cluster, a space, a cluster. So now we need another space. So we're going to skip over here, and you can see the way these are going to stagger back and forward. So into the space, do your cluster, 1 into each one all the way along. So you've created a space in this corner here. So the next row we'll put a cluster into that space. So you'll have a cluster, a space, a cluster and a space all the way up the side of your blanket. And that's how you do the granny stitch in lines. And you can make this rectangle blanket any size you like, any width you want. So I'm at the end and I've got my 3 stitches. I'm going to put a treble crochet into the top of that stitch. And this is how it works. So we're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3 and turn. Now because we've got our space here, so we've got a cluster, a space, a cluster, a space. We need a cluster. Now that 3 is my first stitch. Put 2 more into this space, 1 and 2. And work your way along to the end. You'll put 1 cluster into this space, chain 3 and start the process again. So at the end, I've got my space and I'm going to put my cluster in there. 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3. You'll always be chaining 3 at the end and turn. So I've got cluster, space, cluster, space, cluster. So I need a space. So we're going to jump over into here. Put your first cluster in over here. And that is going to create the space. Now don't do 4 stitches because it makes that hole too big. So there we are. As you can see, your granny cluster jumps back and forward, back and forward. Work to the end. You put a cluster in here and 1 treble crochet into this last stitch. Chain 3 and turn and you'll start a cluster again. And that is how you do your granny stitch in lines, and it's really easy. You just remember cluster space, cluster space, cluster space. So my space is there. I'll work to the end of this row. Now this is just a sample. You can do your chain in sets of 3 as long as you want it. So now I'm at the end. I've got a space, a cluster, I need a space. So I'm just going to put a treble crochet in to that top corner of that cluster. That gives me my space. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3 and turn. That becomes my first stitch. I've got cluster space, cluster space, cluster space. So we're going to make a cluster in this space. So that's my first stitch. Put 2 more into that space. So if you just rewind the video and watch it a couple of times, you'll get the hang of what you're doing up the edge. It keeps a nice straight edge as well. If you want to do a border, all you'll do is put a granny stitch into each of the spaces. put a granny stitch in here, chain 2 and another granny stitch in here, and then put a granny stitch in the spaces. So the corners will be right in the middle of that little cluster. Do 1 granny cluster, 2 chain and 1 granny cluster, and work your way down, and then work up the other side if you want to put a border on your blanket. Now I've done a sample. You might say it's not a very big blanket, but this is a sample showing you what it is. Cluster space, well, cluster space, cluster space, cluster space. And that makes a granny stitch in a straight line. You can make this as long as you want it. Make it as long as you want it. But that is how, for the people who've been asking how to do a granny stitch in straight lines to make blankets, where they're not square and they're not round. So thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. It's completely free to subscribe to the channel. The more subscribers I have, the more I'll get seen on YouTube. The more YouTube will help to promote my channel to be seen a little bit more, in amongst the thousands and thousands of crochet and knitting channels that there are now. And if you click on the bell icon, YouTube will tell you when I put up another tutorial. So until the next time, happy crafting, and I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.